A dying military dog clawed beneath a forgotten forge and uncovered the secret powerful men killed to hide. Homeless at 56, former Navy SEAL Daniel Mercer thought the $10 blacksmith shop hidden deep in the Appalachian Mountains would be his final shelter before life completely broke him. But the first night inside the abandoned forge, his retired K9 Axel began growling at the floor itself. Beneath 50 years of ashen silence, the old dog uncovered a hidden chamber tied to missing soldiers, buried military secrets, and a town that had spent decades hiding the truth. Comment 1 if you'd reopen the forge, or 0 if you'd walk away, and tell us where you're watching from. The freezing rain began just after midnight. It came down in silver sheets across the empty parking lot behind the diner, hissing softly against cracked asphalt and the rusted hood of Daniel Mercer's pickup truck. The neon sign over the diner windows had gone dark an hour earlier, leaving only the weak yellow glow of a security light trembling in the storm. Daniel sat motionless behind the steering wheel, with both hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup that no longer held any heat. The truck smelled faintly of wet canvas, old motor oil, and dog fur. Beside him, Axel slept with his head resting across Daniel's thigh. The old Belgian Malinois twitched in his sleep, paws jerking once against the torn army blanket spread across the bench seat. Gray hairs had begun creeping through the dog's dark muzzle over the past 2 years, and arthritis stiffened his hips whenever temperatures dropped below freezing. Thick scars cut through the fur along his ribs and shoulder. Old combat wounds from another life, neither of them ever talked about, because neither of them could. Daniel stared through the windshield at the rain. At 56 years old, he had survived sniper fire in Fallujah, jungle operations in the Philippines, mountain raids in Afghanistan, and more nights under enemy fire than he could count. But tonight, sitting in a dying pickup truck behind a closed diner outside Wheeling, West Virginia, he felt something he had never felt overseas. Used up. The repossession notice still sat folded beside him on the dashboard. Final notice of seizure, 3 words. That was all it took to erase the last piece of normal life he had left. The trailer was gone now. Everything inside it, his photographs, his tools, his uniforms, the sea chest holding Axel's old K9 harness, had been thrown into a storage unit he could no longer afford after missing 4 months of payments. Daniel rubbed a hand slowly across his face. His fingers trembled from exhaustion, not fear, not cold, exhaustion. The kind that settled into a man's bones after too many years spent fighting battles no one else could see. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. Axel's ears twitched immediately. Daniel stiffened. The sudden burst of light from distant headlights, sliding across the parking lot, sent his pulse hammering before he could stop it. Reflex, muscle memory. The truck interior suddenly felt too small. His breathing shortened instinctively as his eyes snapped toward every reflective surface around him. Mirrors, windows, movement, threat angles. His training never really left. It simply waited quietly beneath the skin until something woke it up. Another flash of lightning lit the cab white for half a second. Daniel's jaw tightened. Not here. Not tonight. He lowered his head and shut his eyes hard, trying to force himself back into the present. Rain. Truck, parking lot, West Virginia. Not Afghanistan, not the valley. But memory didn't care about geography. The smell came first. Wet dirt, burned metal, diesel fuel. Then the screaming started in the back of his mind. Daniel suddenly saw dust clouds exploding across a mountain road, heard radio chatter cutting out beneath gunfire, saw blood soaking through tan uniforms beneath helicopter rotors. His chest tightened violently. He grabbed the steering wheel harder. Breathe, just breathe. Axel lifted his head immediately. The old dog stared at him with alert amber eyes. Daniel turned away before the dog could see the panic building in his face. He hated when Axel saw him like this. A man was supposed to protect his dog, not the other way around. Outside, Headlights swept briefly across the truck again before disappearing into the rain. Daniel tried counting backward the way VA therapists had taught him. 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear. Rain on the windshield, Axel breathing, the ticking engine cooling beneath the hood. Slowly, the memory loosened its grip. Daniel leaned back against the seat and exhaled shakily. "You're okay," he muttered quietly. But he wasn't sure whether he meant himself or the dog. Axel rested his chin against Daniel's arm again, though the dog's eyes remained open now, watchful. Always watchful. Daniel looked down at him. "You remember rain like this?" he asked softly. Axel's ears shifted slightly at the sound of his voice. Daniel almost smiled. Almost. The dog had once leaped through the shattered second-story window of a compound outside Kandahar after catching the scent of explosives hidden beneath a stairwell. 2 Marines would have died if Axel hadn't alerted first. 3 years later, Axel dragged Daniel 50 yards through incoming fire after an IED blast tore through their convoy near Jalalabad. The military awarded medals for things like that. Then they retired dogs and handlers into silence afterward, like old equipment nobody needed anymore. Daniel reached down and scratched gently behind Axel's ears. "You're getting too old for this," he whispered. Axel blinked slowly. Outside, the rain intensified. Water rolled down the windshield in crooked rivers, while wind rattled the truck, hard enough to shake loose rust flakes from beneath the doors. Daniel glanced toward the passenger side mirror and froze. A shape moved beside the truck, fast, too close, every muscle in his body locked instantly. Axel exploded upward with a deep, violent growl that filled the cab like thunder. The dog's bark slammed against the windows hard enough to make Daniel jump. Someone cursed outside. A hand appeared suddenly against the passenger side glass. Then fingers clawed at the locked door handle. Daniel moved before conscious thought caught up. His hand shot beneath the seat and came back gripping the old tire iron he kept there. Another jerk on the handle, another curse outside. Through the rain-streaked glass, Daniel caught sight of a hooded figure trying to force the passenger door open. Axel lunged against the window, snarling savagely. The figure stumbled backward immediately. Daniel shoved the door open and stepped out into the freezing rain, with the tire iron raised. "Back away from the truck," he barked. His voice came out sharp, controlled, military. The hooded man froze near the rear wheel. Young, maybe 25, skinny beneath a soaked hoodie. The man stared at Axel, who stood rigid beside Daniel with teeth fully bared. "Easy, man," the stranger snapped. "I thought the truck was abandoned." Daniel said nothing. Rain streamed down his face while he held the tire iron loosely at his side. The stranger looked from Daniel to Axel again and visibly reconsidered every decision that had brought him into that parking lot. "Forget it," he muttered. Then he disappeared into the darkness between the buildings. Daniel stood there several seconds longer listening to the storm, watching, waiting, old habits. Finally, he lowered the tire iron. Axel pressed tightly against his leg. Daniel looked down at him slowly. "You saved my ass again," he whispered. The dog leaned into him silently. Daniel swallowed hard, maybe for the last time. That thought hit him harder than he expected, because Axel was slowing down now. The dog limped more every month, slept harder, took longer getting into the truck. Some mornings he struggled to stand after cold nights. Daniel had seen enough combat injuries to recognize the signs. Time was winning. And when Axel was gone, Daniel honestly didn't know what came after that. He climbed back into the truck and shut the door against the storm. The clock on the dashboard read 4:17 a.m. No point trying to sleep anymore. He started the engine long enough to run the heater for a few minutes, before shutting it off again to save fuel. By dawn, the storm had weakened to a cold drizzle drifting across the mountains. Daniel drove east along winding Appalachian roads lined with bare trees and abandoned coal towns slowly collapsing into the hillsides. Fog hung low over the valleys like smoke from invisible fires. Around mid-morning, he stopped at a gas station outside a tiny town called Black Hollow. The place had one gas pump, a faded Pepsi machine, and a bulletin board mounted beside the entrance beneath a rusted metal awning. Daniel stepped out stiffly, his knees aching from sleeping upright. Axel climbed carefully from the truck behind him. The dog stretched slowly, favoring his left rear leg. Daniel watched him, with quiet concern, before turning toward the bulletin board. Most of the papers were exactly what he expected. Yard sales, church dinners, tractor repairs, missing cats. Then one photograph caught his eye. An old blacksmith shop, dark wood siding, a cracked chimney, an anvil barely visible inside the doorway. Below the photograph, typed in faded black ink, condemned property, county acquisition claim Black Hollow Forge property minimum claim price, $10 structure unsafe. No historical value determined. Contact county office. Daniel stared at the picture. Something about the forge stopped him cold. Not the building itself. The stillness inside it. Even through the grainy photograph, he recognized order. Discipline. The tools hanging inside the doorway had been positioned carefully before abandonment. Not scattered, not forgotten carelessly. Stored, protected, like someone expected to come back. Axel walked slowly beside him, then suddenly stopped. The old dog stared directly at the photograph. Ears forward, body tense. A low sound rumbled in his throat. Daniel frowned slightly. "What is it?" Axel didn't move. Rainwater dripped steadily from the awning overhead. The mountains beyond the road disappeared beneath fog, and for reasons Daniel could not explain, he suddenly felt as though something far away had just noticed him too. Something waiting quietly in the hills, waiting a very long time, for someone to finally come back. Daniel stood motionless beneath the gas station awning, while cold rainwater dripped steadily from the rusted metal roof beside him. Cars hissed occasionally along the distant highway beyond the hills, but Black Hollow itself remained strangely quiet beneath the gray Appalachian sky. Axel still stared at the photograph. The old Malinois had gone completely rigid, ears raised sharply forward, eyes fixed on the image of the abandoned forge like he recognized something hidden inside it. Daniel frowned. "What do you smell, boy?" Axel gave no response except a low rumble deep in his chest. Daniel looked back at the paper. The blacksmith shop sat crooked beneath leafless mountain trees, its weathered wooden walls nearly black with age. One side of the roof sagged badly. The brick chimney leaned slightly. Rusted farm tools lay half-buried in dead grass around the building like bones left behind after a war. Condemned, unsafe, no historical value determined. Daniel read the words twice. Then something unexpected happened. For the first time in months, he felt curious about tomorrow. That feeling alone startled him. Most mornings lately had felt like endurance tests. Find gas. Find food, keep Axel warm, avoid thinking too far ahead. But standing there in the freezing drizzle, staring at that forgotten forge, Daniel felt something he had not allowed himself in a very long time. Direction. He tore the paper carefully from the bulletin board. Inside the gas station, an old radio played low country music through static, while a teenage cashier watched him from behind the counter with cautious curiosity. Daniel bought 2 coffees, a breakfast sandwich, and a strip of beef jerky for Axel using the last wrinkled $20 bill in his wallet. That left him with $14 and some loose change. Axel waited patiently beside the truck while Daniel handed him small pieces of jerky. "You realize this is probably a stupid idea," Daniel muttered. Axel chewed slowly without taking his eyes off the mountains. Daniel sighed. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I figured that's how you'd vote." By late morning, the road into Black Hollow narrowed into twisting mountain curves lined with abandoned mining shacks and collapsing barns swallowed by brush. Fog drifted low through the valleys, wrapping itself around the hillsides like smoke from old fires. The farther they drove, the older the world seemed to become. Telephone poles leaned at crooked angles, Rusted railroad tracks disappeared beneath weeds. Empty coal tipples stood against the ridges like giant rusting skeletons. Daniel drove slowly, not because the truck struggled on the steep grades, but because something about the silence out here felt heavy. Black Hollow appeared almost without warning around the bend of a wooded ridge. The town looked frozen somewhere between 1975 and collapse. A handful of brick storefronts lined the narrow main street beneath faded signs. Most of the windows were boarded over. A barber pole turned slowly outside an old shop beside the post office. Beyond town, mountains rose dark and endless beneath thick clouds. Daniel noticed people immediately. Not many, but enough. An older man fueling a tractor stopped to watch the truck pass. Two women carrying grocery bags paused outside a pharmacy. A group of teenagers, smoking beside a laundromat, turned toward the sound of Daniel's engine. Strangers stood out here, especially strangers with military posture and an old Belgian Malinois riding shotgun. The county office occupied a 2-story sandstone building near the courthouse square. Daniel parked beside a dented sheriff's cruiser and stepped out into the cold wind with Axel following close behind. Inside, the building smelled faintly of old paper, coffee, and radiator heat. The woman behind the counter looked up from a stack of paperwork as the bell above the door jingled. She appeared to be in her late 60s, with silver hair pinned neatly behind her head and narrow reading glasses hanging low on her nose. Her eyes settled first on Daniel, then Axel, then the paper clutched in Daniel's hand. The woman blinked once. "Well," she said slowly, "I'll be damned." Daniel approached the counter. "I'm here about the Blacksmith property." The woman leaned back carefully in her chair. "The forge," Daniel nodded. Silence stretched several seconds. Outside, wind rattled loose branches against the courthouse windows. Finally, the woman removed her glasses. "My name's Evelyn Pike," she said. "And unless you're lost, you're the first person to ask about that place in over 20 years. Daniel laid the rain-spotted paper on the counter. "It's still available?" Evelyn studied him closely. There was no pity in her expression. That surprised him. Most people looked at homeless veterans with one of three things: awkward sympathy, fear, or exhaustion. Evelyn looked at him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "You from around here, Mr. Mercer." "Daniel Mercer, West Virginia, originally Virginia Beach. You military?" Daniel hesitated only slightly. "Retired Navy." Evelyn nodded once, as though confirming something privately to herself. Then her gaze shifted toward Axel. "And him, military K9. That changed something in her face immediately. Respect. Real respect. Not for Daniel, for the dog. Evelyn stood slowly and disappeared into a back room before returning with a thick property folder, tied together by fading red string. She placed it gently on the counter. "The old Ritter forge," she murmured. "Samuel Ritter owned it until 1974. Daniel opened the file. Inside were yellowed photographs of the blacksmith shop from decades earlier. Horses tied outside, farmers standing beside wagon wheels, a younger man in a leather apron holding iron tongs beside the forge fire. Samuel Ritter. Even in black and white photographs, the man looked solid. Broad shoulders, serious eyes, powerful hands blackened by soot and metalwork. Daniel recognized craftsmen instantly. The discipline showed in posture alone. "What happened to him?" Daniel asked quietly. Evelyn's expression darkened slightly. "Nobody knows exactly." Daniel looked up. "What's that mean?" Evelyn glanced briefly toward the courthouse windows before lowering her voice. "Samuel accused some important people around here of stealing from veterans after the Korean War." She paused. "A few months later, the forge shut down. Samuel disappeared not long after." Daniel said nothing. The old courthouse suddenly felt colder. Evelyn tapped the file lightly. "County seized the property after unpaid taxes. Folks talked about restoring it once upon a time. Never happened." Why? Another pause. Then quietly, "That place buried more than iron." Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the mountains. Axel suddenly moved closer to Daniel's leg. Evelyn noticed. So, she said carefully, you really planning to buy it? Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and counted the remaining bills. $10, 4 singles left afterward. He placed the money on the counter. Evelyn stared at it for a long moment. You sure about this? Daniel looked down at Axel. The old dog's eyes remained fixed toward the mountains beyond town, waiting. Daniel slid the money closer. I've spent $10 on worse things. For the first time, Evelyn smiled slightly. 30 minutes later, Daniel stepped back outside, holding a ring of old iron keys and a folded county deed stamped with fresh signatures. The freezing rain had finally stopped. Fog drifted low between the storefronts while weak afternoon sunlight pushed faintly through the clouds. Across the street sat a diner with steamed windows and a flickering open sign. Daniel's stomach tightened painfully at the smell of food drifting through the cold air. Inside, conversations quieted almost immediately when he entered with Axel. Not hostile, just cautious. The diner looked exactly like every Appalachian roadside diner Daniel had ever seen. Wood-paneled walls, coffee stains on the counter, old veterans drinking silently beneath mounted deer heads and faded football pennants. Axel limped beside him toward an empty booth. Several people watched openly now. One older man wearing a coal company jacket nodded toward the dog. Army dog? Navy, Daniel answered. The man grunted approvingly. A waitress approached carrying menus. She looked about 35 with dark hair tied back loosely and tired blue eyes that softened immediately when she saw Axel. Well, hey there, she whispered gently to the dog. Axel leaned carefully against her hand when she scratched behind his ears. Daniel noticed that. Axel trusted almost nobody. The waitress smiled faintly. What can I get you? Coffee, Daniel said. Whatever's cheapest. She glanced toward the county deed tucked beneath his arm, then toward the muddy truck outside. Understanding flickered quietly across her face. You buy the Ritter place? She asked. Daniel nodded once. The waitress looked genuinely startled. No kidding. You know it. My grandfather used to shoe horses there. She hesitated. Name's Claire Bennett. Daniel introduced himself. Claire studied him carefully for a moment before lowering her voice. You should be careful around Gordon Voss. Daniel frowned slightly. Who's that? As if summoned by the question itself, the diner door opened behind him. Cold mountain air swept across the floor. Footsteps followed, heavy, confident. Daniel turned slowly. The man entering the diner looked to be in his late 40s, broad and thick through the shoulders, with expensive boots and a dark canvas work jacket stretched across a large stomach. 2 younger men followed behind him. Conversation inside the diner died almost instantly. Claire muttered under her breath. That's Gordon. Gordon Voss spotted Daniel immediately. Then his eyes dropped toward the county deed. Something hard flashed behind his smile. Well now, Gordon said loudly. Looks like somebody finally bought the old forge. He walked directly toward Daniel's booth. Axel stood before the man even arrived, not barking, not growling, just standing, rigid, every muscle tight. Gordon stopped several feet away. His smile faded slightly as he looked at the dog. That thing bite? Daniel sipped his coffee calmly. Only when he thinks somebody deserves it. Silence. Several men at the counter hid smiles behind their coffee cups. Gordon's jaw tightened briefly before the friendly expression returned. I'll save us both time, he said. I own the scrapyard outside town. Been trying to buy that property for years. Daniel said nothing. Gordon pulled a thick wallet from his jacket. I'll give you $3,000 cash right now for the deed. The entire diner went quiet. Claire stared openly. Daniel blinked once. $3,000. For a condemned forge nobody wanted, something cold settled quietly into place inside his chest. Because men like Gordon Voss did not throw around money without reason. Daniel folded the deed carefully and tucked it inside his jacket. Not for sale. Gordon's smile vanished completely this time. You ain't even seen the place yet. I'll risk it. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Gordon nodded once slowly. Suit yourself. But his eyes lingered too long. Not on Daniel. On Axel. The old Malinois stared back without blinking. And for the first time since entering town, Daniel realized something important. The people of Black Hollow were not watching him. Because he was homeless. They were watching. Because he had just walked unknowingly into something the town itself had spent 50 years trying not to talk about. Daniel felt it the moment he stepped back outside the diner. Eyes followed him. Not openly, not hostile, but cautious in the way mountain towns watched storms rolling over distant ridges. People here carried silence carefully. Questions stayed buried unless they absolutely had to be asked. Axel climbed slowly into the truck, while Daniel folded himself behind the wheel. The old Malinois did not relax. His ears remained upright, focused, watching the diner windows, even after Gordon Voss disappeared back inside. Daniel started the engine. The pickup groaned unhappily before settling into a rough idle. For several seconds, he sat staring through the windshield at the courthouse square across the street. Wind pushed dead leaves along the sidewalks, while fog drifted between the buildings in pale ribbons. Then Claire Bennett suddenly stepped outside the diner carrying a brown paper bag. Daniel lowered the passenger window halfway. Claire handed the bag carefully through the opening. "You forgot your sandwich," she said. Daniel frowned slightly. "I didn't order another one." "You did now." Before he could answer, she glanced toward the diner windows nervously. "You heading up to the forge tonight?" "That's the plan." Claire hesitated. Then quietly, "If you hear hammering after dark, don't go looking for it." Daniel studied her face. She seemed embarrassed immediately afterward, as though realizing how strange the warning sounded aloud. "That's supposed to mean something?" Claire shook her head too quickly. "People around here tell stories, that's all." "What kind of stories?" But Claire was already stepping backward toward the diner. "Just be careful up there, Mr. Mercer." Then she disappeared back inside. Daniel looked down at the paper bag. Inside sat 2 wrapped sandwiches, a thermos of hot coffee, and several strips of bacon tucked carefully into a napkin for Axel. The dog noticed the bacon instantly. Daniel almost smiled again. Almost. "You're making friends already," he muttered. Axel ignored him completely until the bacon appeared. The road leading toward the forge left town quickly. Within minutes, Black Hollow disappeared behind walls of pine and bare oak, climbing steep mountain slopes beneath thick clouds. The pavement narrowed to cracked blacktop, before turning into old gravel lined with rusted fence posts and abandoned rail equipment slowly sinking into the earth. Fog drifted through the trees in long gray curtains. The deeper Daniel drove, the quieter the world became. No traffic, no houses, only mountains. At one point, the road crossed an old wooden bridge over a narrow creek, swollen dark from rainwater. The bridge groaned beneath the truck's weight. Daniel noticed Axel sitting upright now, nose pressed near the passenger window. Alert again. "What is it?" The dog stared toward the forest. Daniel followed his gaze. Nothing. Just dense Appalachian woods disappearing uphill into fog. Still, the hairs along the back of Daniel's neck lifted slightly. Combat had taught him to trust silence. Sometimes silence meant peace. Sometimes it meant everyone nearby already knew something you didn't. The forge finally appeared late in the afternoon beyond a bend in the road. Daniel slowed immediately. The blacksmith shop stood alone at the edge of a clearing, beneath towering mountain ridges darkened by incoming weather. Dead weeds swayed around the structure. A rusted wagon wheel leaned half-buried beside the porch. The chimney rose crooked against the gray sky like the spine of something ancient refusing to fall. The place looked abandoned, but not empty. That distinction settled heavily in Daniel's chest the longer he stared at it. The building carried the strange dignity of places once built for real work. Not decoration, not tourism. Purpose. The old forge had been important to somebody once. Daniel shut off the truck engine. Silence rolled over the clearing immediately. Even the wind seemed quieter here. Axel climbed down stiffly from the truck and stood motionless facing the building. His tail remained low, focused. Daniel grabbed the ring of iron keys from his jacket and approached the front door carefully. The wooden porch creaked beneath his boots. Close up, the building looked older than the county photographs suggested. Blackened wooden siding bore deep scars from decades of weather. Rust streaked the iron hinges. One window had been boarded shut from the inside years ago. Above the entrance hung a faded wooden sign barely readable beneath peeling paint. Ritter and Son Blacksmithing Est. 1921. Daniel inserted the largest iron key into the lock. It resisted at first, then turned slowly with a deep metallic clunk. The door groaned inward. Cold air rolled out, carrying the smell of ash, wet wood, iron, and something older underneath it all. The smell of extinguished fire. Daniel stepped inside slowly. The interior disappeared into shadows. For several seconds, neither man nor dog moved. Then Daniel's eyes adjusted, and he stopped breathing for a moment. The forge sat, center of the room, like the heart of a dead machine. Brick fire pit. Massive iron hood. Bellows mounted behind it beneath thick layers of soot and dust. Beside the forge stood an enormous anvil, mounted atop a scarred oak stump blackened by decades of hammer strikes. Tools lined the walls, not scattered randomly, organized, hung carefully on iron hooks. Hammers arranged by size, tongs grouped together, chisels stored in neat rows. Everything preserved exactly where someone had left it half a century earlier. Daniel walked slowly deeper into the room. Dust drifted through pale beams of evening light cutting between cracks in the walls. His boots disturbed old coal ash across the floor. He reached down and lifted one hammer carefully from the wall. Heavy, balanced perfectly. The wooden handle remained smooth from years of use. Daniel turned it once in his hand. Someone had cared for these tools deeply. That much was obvious immediately. Axel moved past him slowly toward the forge. The old dog circled it once, then twice, nose working constantly. Daniel set the hammer down. "You find something?" Axel ignored him. The Malinois stopped near the rear wall behind the forge and stared motionless at the dark wooden board several seconds before letting out a low, uneasy sound. Not a growl, not fear exactly. Recognition. Daniel approached carefully. The back wall looked ordinary enough. Aged timber, iron nails, old soot stains running upward toward the ceiling. Still, Axel refused to move away from it. Daniel crouched beside him. "You smell animals?" Axel pressed closer toward the wall. Daniel tapped the wood lightly with his knuckles. Solid, nothing obvious. Still, something about the space felt strange. The forge itself sat several feet farther from the rear wall than necessary. Most blacksmith shops placed the fire pit near the back for ventilation and space efficiency. This one had a wide gap behind it, almost like the forge had been intentionally positioned away from the wall. Daniel filed the observation away quietly. Outside, thunder rolled again across the mountains. Rain began shortly afterward. By nightfall, freezing drizzle rattled steadily against the roof, while darkness swallowed the clearing outside completely. Daniel worked quietly inside the forge room, using a flashlight, and one surviving lantern he found hanging near the workbench. The lantern still contained kerosene. That surprised him. He cleaned the chimney flue, enough to prevent collapse, inspected the bellows mechanism, and swept a section of floor near the forge clear of debris. The work calmed him. Simple tasks, hands busy, mind focused, no crowds, no noise, no memories. At some point, Axel finally relaxed enough to lie beside the anvil, though the dog kept lifting his head occasionally toward the rear wall. Daniel opened Claire's paper bag and shared the second sandwich with him. "5-star dining tonight," he muttered. Axel accepted his half solemnly. Rain hammered harder overhead. The forge room glowed softly beneath lantern light, while shadows trembled across the old tools hanging along the walls. Daniel sat down against one support beam, and stretched his aching legs slowly. For the first time in months, the knot inside his chest loosened slightly. The building felt strangely familiar. Not because he had ever worked a forge before, because the shop understood routine, discipline, maintenance. Every tool here had purpose. Every inch of the room had been arranged by hands that believed work mattered. The military had once felt like that too. Before paperwork replaced people. Before friends started disappearing into statistics. Daniel leaned his head back against the wooden beam. Axel shifted closer beside him. The rain softened outside. Somewhere deeper in the mountains, a train horn echoed faintly through the valleys. Then silence settled again, heavy, comfortable. Daniel closed his eyes. And for the first time in years, he slept. No gunfire, no explosions, no screaming. No dead men calling his name from burning valleys overseas. Only rain against the roof. Warmth from the lantern and Axel breathing quietly nearby. Hours passed. Sometime after 2 in the morning, Axel suddenly exploded upward, barking violently into the darkness. Daniel woke instantly, heart hammering, hand reaching automatically for the combat knife beneath his jacket before he fully opened his eyes. Axel stood rigid near the forge now, barking toward the rear wall, not outside, inside. Daniel grabbed the lantern and crossed the room carefully. Axel. The dog ignored him completely. Hackles raised, body trembling. The barking stopped suddenly. Then Axel released a low growl so deep it barely sounded like a dog anymore. Daniel lifted the lantern higher. The rear wall stared back silently through drifting shadows. Nothing moved, nothing visible. Yet, every instinct Daniel possessed suddenly screamed the same warning. Something was wrong with this place. Then the growling stopped. Axel stepped forward slowly toward the wall and pressed his nose against the wood itself. Daniel noticed something then, very faint, almost invisible beneath decades of soot and age. A narrow seam running vertically between 2 wooden boards behind the forge. Not damage, not a crack, a seam, like part of the wall had once opened. Daniel stared at it. And somewhere beneath the storm outside, he felt the first real stirrings of something impossible beginning to wake inside the old blacksmith shop. The seam in the rear wall was almost invisible beneath decades of soot and weathering. Most people would never have noticed it. But Daniel Mercer had spent most of his adult life surviving because he noticed things other people missed. Disturbed dirt, misaligned windows, changes in breathing, shadows that didn't belong. Now every instinct he possessed focused on that narrow line behind the forge. Axel remained rigid beside it. The old Malinois pressed his nose hard against the wood before stepping back and releasing another low growl. Daniel lifted the lantern closer. The boards themselves looked ancient, blackened by smoke and mountain winters. Yet one section near the center carried slightly different nail heads than the rest. Newer. Not modern, but newer. Someone had altered the wall intentionally. Outside, rain lashed against the roof while wind moaned softly through gaps in the siding. The forge room flickered beneath lantern light, throwing long shadows across the hanging tools. Daniel reached forward slowly and pressed his palm against the wood. Cold, solid, nothing moved. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave him. Axel barked once sharply. Daniel stepped back. Easy. The dog ignored him. His attention remained fixed entirely on the wall. Daniel finally lowered the lantern. Whatever was hidden back there had stayed hidden for 50 years. It could wait until daylight. At least that's what he told himself. The truth was simpler. He was tired, bone tired, and exhaustion made old memories dangerous. Daniel secured the front door carefully before settling back beside the support beam, with the lantern turned low. Axel refused to lie down near him this time. Instead, the dog positioned himself directly between Daniel and the forge, facing the rear wall like a sentry guarding a doorway. Even in sleep, Axel kept watch. Daniel closed his eyes eventually, but rest came unevenly now. Dreams returned. Hot desert wind, the smell of blood. Rotor blades chopping through darkness. a young Marine screaming for a medic that never arrived. Daniel jerked awake sometime before dawn, with sweat cooling across his neck despite the freezing temperatures inside the forge. For one terrible second, he didn't know where he was. His breathing quickened immediately. The walls felt too close, the dark too heavy. Then Axel moved beside him. The dog pressed firmly against Daniel's chest until the panic loosened enough for reason to return. Forge, West Virginia. Safe. Daniel shut his eyes tightly. "I'm okay," he whispered, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. Outside, the storm had passed. Morning fog drifted through the clearing beyond the dirty windows, while pale sunlight spilled weakly across the mountain ridges. Daniel stood stiffly, every joint aching from sleeping on hardwood floors. Axel limped toward the rear wall immediately, back to the same spot, same focus, same tension. Daniel rubbed a tired hand across his beard. "You really aren't letting this go, are you?" The dog scratched once against the floorboards near the forge. Not random scratching, intentional. Daniel stared down carefully. The floor beneath the forge looked different from the rest of the room. Most of the shop used rough-cut oak planks darkened by soot and age. But the section near the forge carried old brickwork beneath layers of ash and coal dust. Heavy brick, built thick, reinforced. Daniel crouched lower. Years of military engineering experience quietly clicked into place inside his mind. The forge wasn't just built away from the wall. It was built over something. A vehicle engine echoed faintly outside. Daniel rose immediately. Axel moved toward the front door with a warning growl already forming. The truck pulling into the clearing belonged to Gordon Voss. Daniel recognized it instantly. A black diesel pickup, polished so carefully it looked out of place against the muddy mountain roads. Gordon stepped out, wearing expensive work boots and a heavy canvas coat. Two younger men remained inside the cab, watching silently through the windshield. Daniel opened the forge door halfway. Cold air swept inside. "Mornin'," Gordon called casually. Daniel said nothing. Gordon glanced past him into the dark forge interior. "You spend the night in there?" "Looks that way." Gordon smiled faintly. "That place ain't fit to live in." Daniel leaned one shoulder against the doorway. "Then I guess it's lucky I'm not picky." The smile faded slightly. Gordon stepped closer onto the porch. "You think about my offer?" Daniel shook his head once. "No. You haven't even seen the property lines yet. I bought the forge, not the scenery." Gordon studied him carefully. Daniel recognized the shift immediately. The man was recalculating, trying to determine whether Daniel was desperate enough to manipulate. Most people assumed homeless veterans were broken in simple ways, easy to pressure, easy to scare. That assumption had gotten dangerous men killed before. Gordon lowered his voice slightly. "You should understand something, Mercer. Folks around here leave that place alone for a reason. Ghost stories, maybe." Daniel held his gaze evenly. Or maybe people got used to pretending they didn't see certain things. That landed harder than Gordon expected. Daniel saw it immediately, a tiny tightening around the eyes, gone almost instantly, but there. "Interesting." Gordon stepped backward slowly. "You military boys always think you smell conspiracies." Daniel shrugged. "Usually because we do." Silence settled between them. Then Gordon's eyes shifted downward toward Axel standing inside the doorway. The old Malinois stared at him without blinking. No barking, no growling, just watching. Gordon visibly disliked that. "Dog's old," he muttered. Daniel's expression hardened instantly. "So are you." The two younger men inside the truck laughed before catching themselves. Gordon ignored them, but his smile disappeared completely now. "You be careful up here, Mercer," he said quietly. "Mountains can turn mean fast." Then he climbed back into the truck. Daniel watched until the vehicle disappeared down the gravel road through the fog. Only then did he close the forge door again. Axel immediately returned to the rear wall. Daniel stared at the dog. "You know something I don't." The Malinois scratched again near the forge bricks. Daniel sighed. "Fine. He spent the next several hours working, not on the wall, on the building itself, partly because repairs genuinely needed doing, partly because physical work kept his mind steady. He patched holes in the roof using warped sheet metal, scavenged from an old shed behind the forge. He repaired sections of collapsed shelving and cleared decades of coal ash from around the fire pit. The work settled something restless inside him. Military life had trained him to need purpose. Without missions, routines, objectives, men like Daniel often unraveled quietly. That was the part civilians rarely understood. War became structure. Then, one day, the structure vanished, and nobody taught you how to live without it. By afternoon, the forge looked slightly less abandoned. Dust no longer coated every surface. Sunlight reached deeper into the room through cleaned windows. The massive anvil emerged from the shadows, like something waking slowly after decades asleep. Daniel ran one rough hand across its steel face, cold, smooth, scarred by thousands of hammer strikes. He imagined Samuel Ritter standing here years earlier. Forge blazing, steel glowing orange, mountain farmers lined outside waiting for horseshoes or repaired plows. Real work, useful work, not paperwork, not therapy appointments. Not forms proving over and over that your nightmares were legitimate enough to deserve medication. Axel suddenly barked sharply. Daniel turned. The dog stood near the rear wall again, more agitated than before. Then Axel did something strange. He pressed his paw directly against one brick at the forge base. Daniel frowned. "Show me." Axel pawed the same spot again. Daniel approached carefully. The brick looked ordinary enough beneath thick layers of soot. Still, he crouched lower and scraped ash aside with his fingers there. A hairline gap around the brick edges, different mortar too. Not original, repaired later. His pulse quickened slightly. Daniel grabbed an old chisel from the workbench and carefully wedged it beneath the brick edge. Nothing. He tried again harder. Still solid, but now he noticed something else. Tiny scrape marks on nearby bricks, repeated wear, like something heavy had once been moved there repeatedly. Daniel leaned back slowly. A hidden compartment? Possible, but why build it beneath a forge? Outside, thunder rolled again through the mountains, though the sky remained pale gray. Snow began drifting lightly across the clearing. Early winter. Daniel sat back against the forge and looked at Axel. "You really want me digging into this, don't you?" Axel stared back intensely. Then came the sound. A distant metallic clang somewhere outside. Daniel froze instantly, hammering, faint, slow. 3 strikes, then silence. Daniel's eyes lifted toward the windows. The mountains outside remained empty beneath drifting snow. Another clang echoed faintly through the valley. Not close, farther up the ridge somewhere. Daniel stood slowly. Claire's warning returned immediately. If you hear hammering after dark, don't go looking for it. But this wasn't dark, and the sound was real. Axel moved toward the door immediately, ears raised sharply. Daniel opened it carefully. Cold wind swept snowflakes across the porch. The clearing stood empty. No vehicles, no people, only silent mountains rising into fog. Then the hammering came again. 3 distant strikes, metal on metal. Axel growled low in his throat. Daniel stared toward the tree line, climbing the ridge behind the forge. Something moved briefly between the pines, too fast to identify, then gone. The old seal instincts returned instantly. Awareness sharpened, breathing slowed, every nerve awake. Someone was watching the forge, and whoever it was knew exactly where to stand to avoid being seen clearly from the clearing below. Daniel stepped back inside slowly and locked the door. The forge suddenly no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied not by ghosts, by secrets. And secrets had a way of turning dangerous once someone started asking the wrong questions. Snow drifted silently across the clearing outside the forge, while Daniel Mercer stood motionless near the locked front door, listening to the mountains. The hammering had stopped, no footsteps, no voices. Only wind moving through pine trees high along the ridge behind the shop. Axel remained stiff beside the doorway, ears forward and eyes fixed toward the woods beyond the clearing. Daniel trusted that reaction more than his own instincts now. The old Malinois had saved his life too many times to ignore warning signs. Still, after nearly 10 minutes passed without another sound, Daniel slowly relaxed his grip on the combat knife hanging beneath his jacket. Probably hunters, or kids messing around in the hills. That's what the logical part of his brain suggested. But another part, the older part shaped by years of war, kept whispering something different. You're being watched. Daniel finally stepped away from the door. The forge room seemed darker now, beneath the fading winter afternoon. Snowflakes drifted past the windows, while the mountain sky slowly dimmed toward evening. Axel returned immediately to the forge, back to the same brick, back to the same hidden place beneath the ash bed. Daniel crouched beside him again. You're not giving this up. Axel pawed the brick once. Deliberate, Daniel exhaled slowly. Fine, he muttered, but we do this smart. He spent the next hour inspecting the forge properly for the first time. The structure itself fascinated him more the longer he studied it. Samuel Ritter had built the fire pit with unusual precision. Heavy fire brick, laid thicker than necessary, reinforced with old railroad steel supports welded beneath the base. Not ordinary blacksmith construction, military construction. Daniel noticed something else too. The bricks nearest the center carried less soot buildup than surrounding sections, despite decades of abandonment, meaning they had been disturbed some time after the forge originally shut down. He sat back on his heels thoughtfully. Someone had opened this forge before, not recently, but after Samuel Ritter disappeared. Axel let out a low whine. Daniel looked toward him. Easy. The dog pressed closer against the forge. The old Malinois seemed anxious now, pacing tight circles around the fire pit before stopping repeatedly at the same section of brickwork. Daniel rubbed tired fingers through his beard. Whatever waited beneath the forge had somehow mattered enough for someone to hide it carefully, and Gordon Voss clearly knew it existed. That bothered Daniel more than anything else, because greedy men rarely feared old buildings. They feared what those buildings protected. Outside, dusk settled quickly across the mountains. The cold deepened with it. Daniel finally stood and looked around the forge room again. He had spent so much time focused on the hidden bricks that he nearly forgot the most immediate problem: heat. The temperature inside the shop had dropped sharply after sunset. His breath now fogged steadily in the lantern glow. He needed fire, real fire. The forge itself stared silently at him from the center of the room, cold, waiting. Daniel walked slowly around it. The bellows mechanism still appeared functional despite age. The iron firepot remained solid beneath the ash. Coal buckets sat against the wall beside several rusted shovels. Samuel Ritter had left the forge sleeping, not dead. That realization settled strangely deep inside Daniel's chest. He moved automatically after that. Work mode, objective task. He cleaned the firepot carefully, scraping decades of ash and clinker loose with one of the old steel pokers hanging nearby. Coal dust rose into the lantern light while Axel watched silently from beside the anvil. The old dog finally seemed calmer, like this was what he had been waiting for. Daniel located dry kindling in a storage bin near the rear workbench, along with several sacks of coal still wrapped in hardened burlap. That surprised him. Coal should not have survived 50 years dry unless someone intentionally stored it carefully. Another mystery, another unanswered question. The mountains outside vanished fully into darkness while Daniel arranged the fire. His hands remembered motions learned long ago during survival training overseas. Small fuel first, controlled airflow, slow heat build. Different tools, same principles. He struck a match. For a brief second, the tiny flame illuminated the forge room in warm gold. Then he lowered it into the kindling. Fire caught slowly at first. A faint crackle, thin smoke curling upward. Daniel worked the bellows carefully. The old leather mechanism groaned like something waking painfully from sleep. Air hissed through hidden vents beneath the firepot. The flames strengthened. Orange light spread gradually across the blackened bricks. Coal began to glow. Heat rolled softly outward into the room. Daniel stared silently at the growing fire. Something about the moment felt bigger than it should have. Not practical, not rational, sacred. As though the building itself had been holding its breath for decades, waiting for this exact thing. The first fire in 50 years, Axel rose slowly to his feet. The dog approached the forge carefully, ears twitching toward the crackling flames. Then something remarkable happened. For the first time since arriving at the shop, Axel relaxed completely. His body loosened. His tail lowered naturally. The constant tension vanished from his shoulders. Daniel watched him closely. "You know this place somehow," he whispered. The dog settled near the warmth of the forge with a deep sigh. Outside, snow continued falling across the clearing, while firelight flickered through the dirty windows into the dark Appalachian night. Daniel stood beside the forge, feeling heat against his face. For the first time in years, he did not feel cold inside. His eyes drifted toward the old tools hanging along the walls. Hammers, tongs, chisels, all waiting. The forge needed iron now, work, purpose. Without fully realizing why, Daniel reached for one of Samuel Ritter's hammers. The tool felt heavy and balanced in his hand, not decorative, made to last generations. He found a length of rusted, mild steel rod beneath the workbench and laid it carefully into the coals. Heat slowly transformed the metal from black to dull red, then brighter, orange. Daniel remembered welding shops from decades earlier, remembered the smell of hot steel and machine oil from Navy repair depots overseas. Useful work. Honest work, no politics, no paperwork, just hands and fire. When the steel glowed bright enough, he lifted it carefully onto the anvil. The first hammer strike echoed through the forge like a gunshot, clear, sharp, alive. Daniel froze slightly afterward. The sound rolled outward across the clearing and into the mountains beyond. A blacksmith's sound, a forgotten sound. He struck again, then again. Each impact sent vibrations through the anvil into the oak stump beneath it. Sparks burst across the dim forge room while steam rose from the hot metal. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked faintly in the valley below. Daniel worked slowly, clumsy at first, then steadier. The steel flattened beneath the hammer into the rough shape of a simple utility hook. Nothing fancy, nothing skilled, but useful and strangely satisfying. Axel watched the entire process without moving. The forge room no longer felt abandoned now. It felt occupied again, alive again. Daniel quenched the finished steel in the slack tub beside the anvil. Steam exploded upward. The sound instantly triggered something deep in his mind. Afghanistan. Explosions, smoke, screaming. Daniel staggered backwards suddenly. The forge room vanished. Sand and gunfire swallowed him whole. His pulse surged violently. Breathing shortened. The walls felt too close again. Too hot. Axel reacted instantly. The old Malinois lunged against Daniel's chest, hard enough to knock him against the workbench, before pressing firmly against him, grounding him, holding him there. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. "Not now," he whispered hoarsely. Axel stayed pressed against him until the memory loosened its grip. Gradually the forge room returned. The fire, the snow, the mountains. Daniel exhaled shakily. He lowered one hand onto Axel's scarred neck. "Good boy." The dog rested his head briefly against Daniel's chest, then suddenly stiffened again, instantly alert. Daniel felt it immediately, the shift. Axel spun toward the forge and barked sharply, once, twice. Then he lunged toward the brick floor beneath the fire pit and began clawing furiously at the same section near the hidden seam. Coal ash scattered everywhere. Daniel grabbed the lantern and rushed closer. Axel, the dog, ignored him completely now. His claws scraped violently across the bricks while deep growls rumbled from his chest. Daniel dropped beside him. The firelight revealed something new. One brick had shifted slightly beneath the scratching, just enough to expose darkness underneath. Daniel's pulse quickened immediately. He seized the steel poker and wedged it carefully into the narrow opening. The brick moved. Not much, but enough, heavy, engineered, deliberate, beneath the forge. Beneath 50 years of ash and silence, something was hidden there, and Axel had just found it. The old Belgian Malinois clawed furiously at the loosened brick, while sparks from the forge drifted upward into the dark rafters overhead. Snow hissed softly outside the windows, but inside the blacksmith shop the firelight had turned everything gold and shadow. Daniel Mercer crouched beside the forge with the steel poker clenched tightly in his hands. His pulse hammered harder now, not fear, anticipation. The kind that came before breaching locked doors overseas. Before entering rooms men had died trying to protect. Axel stepped backward, just enough for Daniel to work. The dog's chest rose heavily from excitement, while his eyes remained locked on the shifting brick beneath the forge. Daniel wedged the poker deeper into the narrow gap and pulled harder. The brick finally broke free with a deep grinding sound. Ash poured downward into darkness below. Daniel froze. There was open space underneath. Not dirt, not foundation, empty space. Axel barked sharply. Daniel grabbed the lantern and lowered it carefully toward the opening. At first he saw only blackness beneath drifting ash, then metal, a steel surface, flat, industrial. He widened the opening further, removing several more bricks one at a time, until a rectangular section of heavy steel became visible beneath the forge. A hatch, welded, hidden perfectly beneath the fire pit itself. Daniel sat back slowly. "What the hell were you hiding down here, Samuel?" Axel whined low in his throat. The hatch measured roughly 3 feet across and appeared reinforced with old railroad steel welded into its edges. A rusted iron ring sat recessed into the center. Daniel brushed soot away carefully. Military-grade construction, no question. No ordinary blacksmith built hidden compartments like this without reason. Outside, wind rattled the trees surrounding the clearing. Daniel suddenly became very aware of how isolated the forge really was. Nobody would hear him scream up here. Nobody would hear anything. He stood immediately and crossed the room toward the front windows, lowering the lantern light instinctively. Dark mountains surrounded the forge on all sides beneath falling snow. Nothing moved. Still, the feeling returned again, watching eyes. Daniel locked the front door twice before returning to the hatch. Axel remained beside it like a guard dog protecting buried treasure. "You already knew this was here somehow," Daniel muttered. The dog's ears twitched. Daniel grabbed an old wrench from the workbench and hammered carefully at the rusted hinges, securing the hatch frame. The metal resisted at first before finally giving way beneath repeated strikes. Each clang echoed loudly through the forge, too loudly. Daniel hated noise when he couldn't control who heard it. Finally, the last hinge snapped loose. Silence rushed back into the room. Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. Then he wrapped both hands around the iron ring. The hatch barely moved at first. Heavy, very heavy. He pulled harder. Metal screamed against metal. Then slowly, the hatch lifted. Cold air rolled upward from the darkness beneath the forge, carrying the smell of damp earth, machine oil, old iron, and something else underneath it all. Aged paper, forgotten time. Daniel raised the lantern carefully over the opening. A narrow chamber appeared, below reinforced with rusted steel beams and old railroad plates bolted into the dirt walls. Wooden crates sat stacked against one side beneath thick layers of dust, military footlockers. 3 of them. Axel released a soft sound almost like recognition. Daniel stared silently down into the hidden room. Someone had built this place carefully, secretly, and whatever Samuel Ritter hid beneath the forge had remained untouched for half a century. Daniel descended slowly, using an old iron ladder bolted into the wall beneath the hatch. The chamber ceiling forced him to duck slightly once below. Cold earth surrounded him on all sides. The lantern light trembled across old crates, rusted ammunition tins, and shelves lined with yellowed notebooks wrapped in oilcloth. Dust covered everything. No footprints, no disturbances. Nobody had entered this chamber in decades. Daniel's breathing slowed instinctively, careful, methodical, the same way he once searched hidden compounds overseas. Axel remained above near the hatch opening, watching silently. Daniel approached the nearest footlocker first. United States Army. The faded stencil remained barely visible across the green metal lid. A smaller marking beneath it read, Korean War. Daniel opened the latch carefully. Inside lay dozens of military dog tags bundled together by faded twine. His stomach tightened. There were too many, far too many. Beneath them sat several leather-bound journals wrapped carefully in waxed cloth, alongside stacks of military records, stamped confidential across the front. Daniel lifted one dog tag slowly into the lantern light. Private First Class Henry Lawson. No death date, no burial location, nothing, just a name. Daniel reached deeper into the locker. Photographs, black and white, soldiers standing beside cargo crates, military camps, snow-covered Korean villages. Then one photograph stopped him cold. 4 men stood beside a military transport truck. One wore a leather blacksmith apron over army fatigues. Samuel Ritter, younger, hard-eyed. Beside him stood 2 army officers, and beside them a younger Gordon Voss's father. Daniel stared at the photograph carefully. The resemblance was unmistakable. Same thick neck, same eyes, same expression. The lantern light flickered softly in the underground chamber. Daniel's pulse quickened. This wasn't hidden gold, this was evidence. Axel suddenly barked, once sharply from above. Daniel snapped his head upward instantly. The dog stood rigid near the hatch opening, staring toward the forge windows. Listening. Daniel killed the lantern flame immediately. Darkness swallowed the chamber whole. Silence. Absolute silence, then crunch. Snow outside. Footsteps. Daniel's body tightened instantly. Someone was outside the forge. He moved silently toward the ladder and listened. Another crunch. Slow, careful, circling the building. Daniel climbed halfway up the ladder until one eye cleared the hatch edge. The forge room remained dark except for glowing coals still pulsing softly inside the fire pit. Axel stood near the front windows now without making a sound. Perfectly trained, perfectly still. Then Daniel saw it. A shadow passed briefly across the snow outside, human, watching the forge. Daniel stayed frozen. The shadow lingered several seconds beyond the dirty glass, before disappearing again into darkness. No vehicle engine followed. Whoever it was had walked there. Daniel remained motionless another full minute, before finally climbing out of the chamber. Axel immediately pressed close beside him. Daniel lowered one hand onto the dog's neck. Good boy. The Malinois stayed focused on the windows. Daniel quietly lowered the hatch closed again and slid several forge bricks back into place above it. Not perfect, but hidden enough for now. His mind raced. Gordon Voss, Samuel Ritter, missing soldiers, hidden army records. Something enormous had happened here decades ago. Something powerful enough to bury evidence beneath a forge for 50 years. Daniel sat heavily beside the anvil. The fire crackled softly nearby, while snow continued falling beyond the windows. His eyes drifted toward the hidden hatch beneath the forge, then toward Axel. The old dog finally relaxed slightly now that the chamber had been uncovered, almost satisfied, like he had completed a mission. Daniel looked at him carefully. You knew there was something wrong here before I did. Axel blinked slowly. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the recovered dog tags. Henry Lawson, a missing soldier. Maybe one of many. Daniel rubbed the metal between his fingers thoughtfully. The army had taught him long ago that the dead only disappeared when nobody remembered their names anymore. Somebody had hidden these names intentionally. Somebody had buried truth beneath iron and fire. and now that truth belonged to him. Outside, the wind strengthened across the mountains. The forge groaned softly around them like an old ship in rough water. Daniel suddenly realized something chilling. If Gordon Voss knew the chamber existed, then Gordon would eventually come looking for whatever Daniel had found. And men willing to protect secrets for 50 years rarely stopped at threats. The snowstorm deepened through the night. Wind pushed hard against the walls of the forge, while the old building groaned softly around Daniel Mercer and Axel, like something alive beneath the mountains. The fire in the forge had burned low now, glowing red beneath drifting ash and sending slow waves of warmth across the room. Daniel sat beside the anvil with one of Samuel Ritter's journals resting open across his knees. Axel lay nearby, though the old Malinois kept lifting his head toward the windows every few minutes. Still guarding, always guarding. Daniel rubbed tired fingers across the worn leather cover of the journal before opening the first page carefully. The handwriting inside was neat, disciplined, military handwriting. January 14th, 1954. Snow came early this year. Men still missing. Nobody in town asks questions anymore. Daniel frowned slightly. He turned the page. The next entry stretched several paragraphs longer. The officers said the records were lost during transport. That was the official story. But I watched crates unloaded at night from army trucks with my own eyes. Gold shipment boxes, dog tags, personal effects. Men hid overseas, never made it home, because someone already sold them before they could. Daniel sat perfectly still. Outside, wind rattled the forge windows sharply. He kept reading. Samuel Ritter described returning home from Korea after the war and discovering that military supply shipments intended for dead soldiers' families had disappeared somewhere between federal depots and local distribution centers. Gold reserve transfers, family compensation payments, personal belongings, even death records. According to Samuel, several officers assigned to regional processing stations had been stealing military assets for years. But what stopped Daniel cold was the next name, written repeatedly throughout the journal. Thomas Voss, Gordon's father. Daniel leaned back slowly. The forge crackled softly nearby. The journal pages trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, but from anger building quietly inside him. He understood corruption. Military men always did. War created opportunities for predators. There were always men who learned how to profit from chaos, while better people bled beside them. But stealing from dead soldiers. Daniel shut his eyes briefly. That crossed into something uglier. Axel rose slowly and approached him. The dog rested his chin gently against Daniel's knee. Daniel lowered one hand automatically onto the old Malinois' head. You knew something bad happened here. Axel's ears twitched slightly. Daniel opened another journal. This one contained names, dozens of them. Soldiers officially listed as missing, unrecoverable, administrative have transfer, record incomplete. Beside many names, Samuel had written short notes in careful pencil. Family never informed. Compensation vanished. Dog tags never returned. Body identified incorrectly. Daniel's stomach tightened harder with every page. Then he found the entry that changed everything. March 3rd, 1956. Walter Kane tried taking copies of the records to Charleston. Told me if anything happened to him, I was to hide the evidence. Walter trusted too easily. Men like Voss do not leave witnesses alive. Daniel stopped breathing for a moment. Walter Kane, the military dog handler. Samuel had mentioned him before. Daniel turned the page quickly. Walter never arrived in Charleston. State police found his truck burned near Richwood. They called it an accident before the fire even cooled. I know better. His shepherd survived long enough to crawl 3 miles back toward town before dying beside the river bridge. Daniel stared at the page silently. Beside him, Axel shifted closer. Daniel imagined it instantly. An injured military dog dragging itself through snow, trying to get home after losing its handler. Something deep inside his chest tightened painfully. He looked down at Axel. You had done the same thing. The old Malinois blinked slowly. Daniel kept reading. Samuel Ritter had hidden copies of the military records beneath the forge after Walter Kane's death. According to the journals, several townspeople suspected the truth, but stayed silent out of fear. Fear became tradition, then silence became permanent, until now. The lantern flame flickered softly while Daniel read for hours. Samuel's journals gradually shifted from investigation into confession. The blacksmith described insomnia, nightmares, isolation, paranoia, the same symptoms Daniel carried himself. One passage stopped him completely. War follows men home differently. Some hear explosions, some hear names. Some simply stop belonging anywhere except beside work and silence. Daniel lowered the journal slowly. The forge room suddenly felt very small, very personal, because Samuel Ritter had described PTSD decades before anyone around here would have even known the word. Another entry. I don't trust crowds anymore. Noise makes my hands shake. I built the hidden room because secrets feel safer underground where men cannot lie to them. Daniel exhaled shakily. For the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, he no longer felt like he was reading about a stranger. Samuel Ritter had become real. A veteran trying to survive after war rearranged something permanently inside him. Daniel looked around the forge again. The organized tools, the reinforced walls, the careful routines preserved beneath dust. This wasn't just a workshop. It had been Samuel's shelter, his bunker against the world. Daniel understood that far too well. The mountains outside disappeared completely beneath heavy snowfall, while the forge burned quietly through the night. At some point, Daniel opened the final journal. The last pages had been written in noticeably shakier handwriting. August 9th, 1974. If someone eventually finds this room, then either I am dead or too old to keep guarding it myself. Thomas Voss threatened me again this morning. He said memory dies faster than iron rusts. Maybe he is right, but maybe some things wait longer than evil men expect. Daniel swallowed hard. The final paragraph was shorter. To whoever opens this forge again, do not let them bury these men twice. Silence filled the room afterward, deep, heavy. Daniel sat staring into the forge fire while snow buried the clearing outside inch by inch. Axel eventually climbed beside him and rested his head across Daniel's lap. The simple weight of the dog grounded him more than medication ever had. Daniel stared absently at the flames. Then suddenly another memory surfaced. Not war this time. Home, Virginia Beach. His ex-wife standing beside packed boxes near the front door years earlier. You left pieces of yourself overseas and never came back for them, Daniel. At the time, he'd been angry hearing it. Now, sitting inside Samuel Ritter's forge, he realized she had been right. The military trained men to survive impossible situations, but nobody taught them how to return afterward. Daniel looked down at Axel again. You're the only one who stayed. The old Malinois thumped his tail once weakly against the floorboards. Daniel smiled faintly despite himself. Then his expression darkened again. Because now he understood why Gordon Voss wanted the forge. Not for money, not for land, for silence. The journals alone could destroy reputations stretching back generations. Daniel rose slowly and crossed toward the hidden hatch again. He reopened the chamber carefully and removed several items. The journals, the photograph, the army records, the dog tags. Not all of them. Only enough to keep hidden elsewhere if someone broke into the forge. When he climbed back out, dawn had begun faintly whitening the mountain sky beyond the windows. Snow covered the clearing completely now. Axel stood near the door again, alert. Daniel moved quietly beside him. Tracks, fresh footprints circled the forge outside. Several sets. Daniel's jaw tightened immediately. Someone had returned during the night. Watching, waiting. The tracks led toward the tree line behind the forge, before disappearing into the snow-covered woods. Axel growled low. Daniel stared toward the mountains. The game had changed now. Whoever watched the forge knew someone had reopened it. And if Gordon Voss suspected Daniel found Samuel Ritter's hidden chamber, things were about to become dangerous very quickly. The fresh footprints circled the forge like wolves testing a fence line. Daniel stood near the front porch, staring at them while pale morning light crept slowly across the snow-covered clearing. 3 separate sets of tracks moved around the building before disappearing back toward the trees behind the ridge. Not random, not curious teenagers, surveillance. Axel stood beside him, rigid and silent, his breath drifting in white clouds through the cold mountain air. Daniel crouched beside the nearest footprint. Work boots, large tread, heavy man. Another set appeared narrower, lighter, probably younger. The third set stopped briefly beneath the side window, where someone had clearly stood watching inside. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had spent years tracking insurgents through mountain valleys overseas. Snow made careless people honest. These men had approached quietly, circled the forge carefully, and left without forcing entry. Reconnaissance. Nothing more, yet. Daniel rose slowly and looked toward the woods. The Appalachian Mountains stood silent beneath fresh snow while fog drifted between the trees like pale smoke. Someone up there already knew the forge was awake again. Inside, the fire still glowed low beneath the forge bricks. Daniel secured the journals and records carefully inside an old canvas sea bag he found in Samuel Ritter's hidden chamber. He wrapped the dog tags separately in oilcloth before hiding everything temporarily beneath loose floorboards inside the loft storage above the forge. Not the hidden chamber, too obvious now. Axel watched him the entire time. "You don't trust this place anymore either," Daniel muttered. The old Malinois blinked slowly. By afternoon, the snowstorm finally eased, though heavy clouds still buried the mountain ridges in gray shadow. Daniel spent the day reinforcing the forge doors and repairing broken window latches using scrap iron from the workshop. Every sound outside made him pause now. Every gust of wind through the trees, every distant engine. War changed men that way. Once danger announced itself clearly. Later it hid in ordinary noises. Around dusk, headlights finally appeared, climbing the road toward the forge. Daniel's muscles tightened automatically. But Axel did not growl. That mattered. Claire Bennett's truck rolled slowly into the clearing, carrying several grocery bags in the passenger seat. She stepped out wearing a heavy winter coat and knit gloves while snow crunched beneath her boots. "You look like hell," she said immediately. Daniel almost smiled faintly. "Good evening to you, too." Claire carried the groceries inside before noticing the repaired forge. Then the fire. Her expression changed instantly. "You lit it." Daniel nodded once. Claire stared silently at the glowing forge for several seconds. "My grandfather used to say you could hear this place working all the way from town when Samuel Ritter was alive." Daniel poked at the coals carefully. "It still works." Claire walked slowly around the shop, taking in the cleaned tools and repaired walls. The forge no longer looked abandoned now. It looked inhabited again, alive again. "You staying here for good?" she asked quietly. Daniel shrugged. "Long as nobody kicks me out." Claire hesitated before setting a paper bag onto the workbench. "I brought food." Inside sat canned soup, bread, coffee, and fresh meat for Axel. Daniel stared at the supplies. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." Silence settled briefly between them while snow drifted softly outside. Then Claire's eyes moved toward the forge bricks, toward the section Axel kept guarding instinctively. "You found something here, didn't you?" Daniel's expression remained unreadable, but Claire noticed anyway. "I knew it," she whispered. Daniel studied her carefully. "What exactly do people in this town think happened to Samuel Ritter?" Claire leaned against the workbench slowly. "My grandfather," said Samuel, changed after Korea. "Stopped trusting people. Started carrying a shotgun everywhere." She paused. "Then one day he accused several local businessmen of stealing military compensation money meant for soldiers' families. People believed him? Some did. Claire lowered her voice. Then Walter Kane died. Daniel's attention sharpened instantly. You know that name? Claire nodded slowly. He was Samuel's best friend, army dog handler. Supposedly died in a truck fire near Richwood. Her eyes shifted briefly toward Axel. But folks around here always said the dog tried dragging him out of the wreck. Daniel looked down at the old Malinois lying beside the forge. The room suddenly felt colder. Claire noticed his expression immediately. What did you find? Daniel hesitated. Then, proof. Claire went completely still. Before she could answer, Axel exploded upward, barking violently toward the front windows. Daniel reacted instantly. The forge lights went dark as he killed the lantern flame with one motion. Silence. Out's tires crunched slowly across snow. Another vehicle entering the clearing. Not Claire's. Daniel moved toward the window carefully. 2 trucks, black pickups. No headlights now. Just engines idling outside in darkness. Claire whispered nervously. Daniel. He raised one hand quietly. Axel growled low beside the door. Then came heavy footsteps on the porch. 3 men, at least. Daniel's pulse slowed automatically. Combat calm. Old instincts sliding back into place. A fist hammered once against the front door. Mercer! Gordon Voss's voice boomed through the wood. Open up! Neither Daniel nor Claire moved. Another bang rattled the door harder. I know you're in there, Axel's growling deepened. Daniel stepped toward the forge slowly, eyes scanning the room automatically. Possible weapons, escape routes, angles, distance. The old blacksmith shop suddenly felt very much like a defensive position. Gordon banged the door again. Then, you found something under this forge, didn't you? Silence. Snow hissed softly outside. Daniel said nothing. That was answer enough. The voice beyond the door changed immediately. No friendliness now, only threat. That evidence belongs to my family, Daniel finally spoke. No, he said calmly. It belongs to dead soldiers. Silence outside. Then one of the men cursed softly. Gordon's voice returned colder than before. You have no idea what you stepped into. Daniel glanced toward Claire. Fear showed openly across her face now. He lowered his voice. Get upstairs. Loft corner behind the chimney. Claire hesitated. Daniel now. She obeyed immediately. Axel moved closer beside Daniel as footsteps shifted outside the forge. Then came the sound Daniel had expected from the moment he found the hidden chamber. Metal scraping against the door. Pry bars. They're coming in, Claire whispered from above. Daniel grabbed Samuel Ritter's old blacksmith tongs from beside the forge. Heavy, solid steel. Good reach, not ideal, but workable. The front door groaned violently as men forced against it from outside. Wood cracked. Another shove. The hinges screamed. Axel's barking turned savage now. The old Malinois positioned himself directly beside the opening, body trembling with aggression despite his age. Daniel crouched slightly beside him. Easy. Another crash. The door burst inward halfway before jamming against the floor. 3 men pushed through, blowing snow into the forge. Gordon first, crowbar in hand. 2 younger men behind him carrying flashlights and hunting rifles. The forge fire cast violent shadows across the room while snow swirled through the broken doorway. Gordon spotted Daniel immediately. Where are the journals? Daniel said nothing. One of the younger men moved toward the forge. That was the mistake. Axel hit him first. The old Malinois launched across the room with terrifying speed despite his arthritis. The man screamed as Axel slammed him backward into the anvil stand, jaws locking onto his forearm. The rifle clattered away. Chaos exploded instantly. The second intruder swung the crowbar wildly. Daniel moved. Years of SEAL training returned all at once. Fast, cold, precise. He struck the man's wrist with the blacksmith tongs hard enough to disarm him before driving him backward into the forge table. Sparks burst upward. Gordon lunged toward the hidden hatch area. Daniel intercepted him violently, slamming the older man against the brick forge wall. The room filled with shouting, barking, crashing steel. Then suddenly, Axel cried out, sharp, painful. Daniel turned instantly. The younger intruder had drawn a hunting knife. Blood darkened Axel's shoulder fur. The old Malinois still refused to release the man's arm. Rage detonated inside Daniel, pure instant. He crossed the room in 2 strides and drove the intruder backward against the forge with terrifying force. The knife clattered across the floor. Daniel pressed Samuel Ritter's Blacksmith tongs against the man's throat, while forge heat roared beside them. "Drop it," he growled. The man froze completely. Gordon staggered backward, breathing hard. Blood ran from his lip where Daniel had struck him. "This isn't over," Gordon hissed. Daniel's eyes never left him. "It is for tonight." Silence filled the forge except for Axel's heavy breathing. Snow blew through the broken doorway. Finally, Gordon grabbed the wounded intruder and backed toward the trucks outside. But before leaving, he looked directly at Daniel. "You should've stayed homeless." Then they disappeared into the storm. The truck engines roared moments later before fading down the mountain road. Silence returned slowly afterward. Daniel dropped beside Axel immediately. Blood soaked the dog's shoulder. Too much blood. Axel tried standing again anyway, still trying to protect him. Daniel's hands shook for the first time all night. "Hey," he whispered urgently. "Stay with me." Claire climbed down from the loft pale and trembling. "Oh my God." Daniel pressed both hands against the wound. The blood kept coming. Outside, snow began falling harder again, and Daniel realized with growing horror that the nearest veterinary clinic sat nearly 40 miles away, through mountain roads, already disappearing beneath another blizzard. Axel lay on the forge floor, breathing hard. Blood spread steadily through the dark fur along his shoulder and ribs, dripping slowly onto the old wooden planks beneath him. The old Malinois still tried, lifting his head every few seconds toward the broken doorway, as though he intended to keep guarding the forge no matter what damage had been done to him. Daniel dropped to both knees beside the dog. "Stay with me," he whispered. His hands pressed tightly against the wound, while panic clawed at the edges of his control. "Not now. Not Axel. Not after everything." Claire Bennett rushed beside him, carrying clean towels from the loft. "Oh God." Daniel wrapped pressure against the wound carefully. The blood soaked through almost immediately. Axel whimpered once, but never snapped or pulled away. His amber eyes stayed locked on Daniel's face the entire time. Trust, absolute trust, that somehow hurt worse than the blood itself. Daniel swallowed hard. "I need my truck keys." Claire grabbed them from the workbench instantly. Outside, wind screamed through the clearing hard enough to rattle the forge walls while snow buried the tracks Gordon Voss's trucks had left behind minutes earlier. The storm was worsening fast. Daniel slid one arm carefully beneath Axel's chest. The old Malinois tried standing on his own first, still trying to work, still trying to protect. Daniel's throat tightened painfully. "Easy, buddy. I got you." Axel finally relaxed enough to let Daniel lift him. The dog felt heavier than he remembered, older, fragile in ways Daniel had spent years pretending not to notice. Claire hurried ahead to open the truck door, while Daniel carried Axel through the snow. Cold wind hit them instantly. The mountains had vanished completely behind whiteout conditions now. Snow swirled across the clearing beneath violent gusts, while ice snapped through the trees along the ridge. Daniel laid Axel carefully across the passenger seat beneath the old army blanket. Blood spread quickly through the fabric. Claire leaned into the cab window. "There's a veterinary clinic near Beckley," she shouted above the wind. "Dr. Harris. It's the only one open overnight." "How far?" 40 miles if the roads stay clear." They both looked at the storm. Neither believed the roads were clear anymore. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly. Claire touched his arm briefly. "You can make it." Daniel nodded once. But fear had already settled deep inside him. Not fear of the storm. Fear of losing the last living thing that still needed him. The truck fishtailed twice before reaching the main road. Snow hammered the windshield in thick waves, while the old wipers struggled to keep up. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, beyond the weak yellow headlights cutting through white darkness. Axel's breathing sounded rough beside him. Daniel kept one hand on the steering wheel, and the other pressed against the towels wrapped around the dog's wound. "Stay awake," he muttered. The Malinois blinked weakly. Daniel's chest tightened harder. Years earlier, Axel had dragged him unconscious through smoke after an explosion tore apart their convoy outside Jalalabad. Daniel remembered waking beside the dog in a ditch while bullets cracked overhead, and Axel stood bleeding over him, refusing to abandon his position. The dog had saved his life more than once. Now Daniel could do nothing except drive. The mountain road twisted sharply through the storm. Ice covered the curves. The truck slid dangerously near one embankment before Daniel corrected hard against the skid. Axel whimpered softly. "Sorry," Daniel whispered immediately. He looked over. The old dog's breathing had become shallow now. Too shallow. Daniel's pulse surged. "Hey," he said louder. "Stay with me, buddy." No response. Fear hit him then with terrifying force. Not combat fear, not survival fear, grief raw and immediate. Daniel suddenly remembered another night years earlier, Afghanistan. A medic kneeling beside a wounded Marine, whispering the exact same words. "Stay with me. Please stay with me." The memory punched through him so hard his vision blurred. The truck drifted briefly across the center line before Daniel corrected sharply. "Focus, drive. Keep him alive." Snow battered the windshield harder. Daniel lowered one shaking hand onto Axel's neck. "You remember Kandahar?" he said quietly. "You remember dragging my sorry ass through that alley?" Axel's ears twitched faintly. Daniel swallowed hard. "Yeah," he whispered. "That's right." Talking helped. Kept both of them anchored. So Daniel kept talking about things nobody else knew. The time Axel stole an entire steak off a lieutenant colonel's plate overseas. The sandstorms in Iraq, sleeping beside helicopters. How Axel used to bark at squirrels but ignore gunfire completely. Anything, everything, just to keep hearing sound inside the truck. Because silence felt dangerous now. At one point the road disappeared entirely beneath drifting snow. Daniel slowed almost to a crawl. The truck engine groaned beneath the strain while wind shoved against the doors hard enough to shake the entire cab. His hands cramped painfully around the steering wheel. Exhaustion crept into his bones. Then Axel suddenly shifted beside him. Daniel looked over instantly. The dog's eyes had closed. Axel, no response. Fear exploded through him. Axel. The Malinois stirred weakly, but did not fully open his eyes. Daniel's voice cracked. "Don't you do this to me." The words escaped before he could stop them. Too honest, too real. He gripped the wheel harder. "You're not allowed to leave yet, you hear me?" Outside, lightning flashed across the mountains, illuminating endless snow-covered ridges for half a second before darkness swallowed them again. Daniel barely saw it. His entire world had narrowed down to the wounded dog bleeding beside him. "You're all I got left," he whispered. Silence. Then quietly, "My son won't even answer my calls anymore." The confession surprised him. He hadn't spoken those words aloud in almost a year. But the storm stripped people down, made honesty unavoidable. Daniel stared through the windshield while memories surfaced one after another. His ex-wife packing boxes silently. His son standing stiffly in the driveway, refusing to hug him goodbye after Daniel missed another birthday because of deployment. VA waiting rooms, pills, nightmares, empty apartments. One job after another, falling apart because crowds made him anxious and loud noises sent him somewhere else mentally for minutes at a time. But Axel had stayed. Through every motel room, every truck stop, every bad night. The old dog never once looked at him like he was broken. Daniel wiped one trembling hand across his eyes angrily. "Don't die on me tonight," he whispered. Finally, nearly 2 hours after leaving the forge, faint lights appeared through the storm ahead. Beckley Veterinary Emergency Clinic. Daniel nearly missed the driveway entirely because of the snow. He slammed the truck into park before the vehicle fully stopped moving. The clinic doors burst open as he carried Axel through the storm. A veterinarian in green scrubs rushed forward immediately. "What happened?" "Knifed wound," Daniel said hoarsely. The vet's expression tightened at the amount of blood. "How old is he?" 12. The veterinarian hesitated only slightly. "Old for a working Malinois. Too old for heavy blood loss. Bring him back now." Daniel followed until a nurse stopped him outside surgery doors. "We need room to work." Daniel looked at Axel one last time. The old dog lifted his head weakly toward him, despite everything. Still checking on him. Still making sure Daniel was okay. The doors swung shut between them. Silence followed. Daniel stood motionless in the empty hallway, while snow hammered against the clinic windows outside. His clothes were soaked with blood and melted snow. His hands shook uncontrollably, now that there was nothing left to do. He sank slowly into one of the waiting room chairs and stared at the floor. Time lost meaning after that. Minutes, maybe hours. The clinic remained almost empty, except for the distant hum of medical equipment and winter wind rattling against the building. Daniel finally bowed his head into his hands. For the first time since leaving the military, he prayed, not polished church prayers, just desperate words from a tired man sitting alone in a snowstorm. Please, please let him stay. Because the truth Daniel Mercer finally understood in that empty veterinary hallway was simple enough to break him completely. If Axel died, there might not be enough left inside him to come back from it. Daniel Mercer sat alone beneath the pale fluorescent lights of the veterinary clinic, while snow battered the windows outside like handfuls of gravel thrown from the dark. Midnight had passed hours ago, though time no longer seemed to move normally inside the waiting room. The heater hummed softly. A coffee machine clicked somewhere down the hallway. Otherwise, silence. The kind of silence that forced a man to sit alone with every memory he spent years trying to outrun. Daniel leaned forward in the chair with his hands clasped tightly together between his knees. Axel's blood had dried dark across his sleeves. He couldn't stop staring at it. The surgery doors finally opened sometime near dawn. Daniel stood immediately. The veterinarian stepped into the hallway, pulling off blood-stained gloves. Exhaustion showed plainly across his face. For one terrible second, Daniel already knew. Then the doctor spoke. He made it through surgery. Daniel closed his eyes. Relief hit so hard his knees almost gave out beneath him. The veterinarian continued carefully. He lost a lot of blood. At his age, recovery's going to be rough. But the knife missed the lung by less than an inch. Daniel swallowed hard. "Can I see him in a minute?" The veterinarian studied him quietly. "That dog's tough." Daniel nodded faintly. "You have no idea." The doctor leaned against the hallway wall. Whoever trained him did exceptional work. A humorless smile crossed Daniel's face. "I did." That surprised the veterinarian. Daniel looked toward the surgery room doors. "We spent 8 years deployed together." The doctor whistled softly beneath his breath. "Well," he said quietly, "that dog wasn't trying to survive tonight." Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "He kept trying to stand back up during treatment." The veterinarian shook his head. "Animals don't usually do that after trauma, unless they're trying to protect somebody." Daniel looked down at the dried blood on his hands again. The doctor rested one hand gently against his shoulder before walking away. Several minutes later, a nurse finally led Daniel toward recovery. Axel lay beneath warm blankets inside a dim room, smelling faintly of antiseptic and wet fur. Tubes ran from one foreleg while bandages wrapped heavily around his shoulder and ribs. The old Malinois opened his eyes immediately when Daniel entered. Still checking the room, still making sure the threat was gone. Daniel sat carefully beside him. "Easy, buddy." Axel's tail thumped weakly once beneath the blankets. Daniel lowered his forehead gently against the dog's neck. For several seconds, neither moved. Outside, the storm slowly weakened with dawn. The mountains beyond the clinic windows emerged beneath pale gray skies and endless snow-covered ridges. Daniel stayed beside Axel most of the morning. At some point, Claire Bennett arrived carrying coffee and a folded newspaper under one arm. Her eyes widened slightly, seeing Daniel still covered in bloodstains. "How is he?" "He's alive," Claire exhaled visibly. Then she handed Daniel the newspaper. Front page. Black Hollow business owner questioned after violent incident. Gordon Voss's photograph stared back beneath the headline. Daniel frowned. "What happened?" Claire sat down beside him quietly. "After you left the forge, Gordon's nephew panicked and ran his mouth at the sheriff's office." She lowered her voice. Word spread fast after that. Daniel opened the paper. According to the article, deputies responding to reports of gunfire near the forge had discovered signs of forced entry and assault. Gordon claimed Daniel attacked them first, but somebody else in town had already started talking. Older veterans, retired miners, people who remembered Samuel Ritter. And once people started talking, everything buried beneath Black Hollow began surfacing. Claire pointed toward another article, lower on the page. Missing soldiers investigation reopened. Daniel stared at it silently. "The sheriff contacted federal investigators this morning," Claire explained. "Apparently, some of those names from Samuel's records match unresolved military cases from the 50s. Daniel leaned back slowly. Outside the recovery room window, snow slid softly from pine branches beneath rising morning light. For 50 years, Samuel Ritter had waited for someone to believe him. Now suddenly, the entire mountain town had started remembering. Claire looked carefully at Daniel. "You found enough evidence to destroy people, didn't you?" Daniel nodded once. Her expression darkened. "My grandfather used to say Samuel Ritter stopped sleeping near the end." She hesitated. "He thought people were watching the forge constantly." Daniel looked toward Axel. He was right. Claire followed his gaze toward the dog. "You know, folks around town still talk about Walter Kane's shepherd." Daniel said nothing. "The dog supposedly stayed beside the burned truck for 2 days before anybody found him." Claire's eyes softened slightly. "People around here never forgot that part." Daniel rested one hand carefully across Axel's neck. Loyalty. That was what stayed behind after everything else burned away. Not medals, not speeches. Loyalty. By afternoon, federal agents had already arrived in Black Hollow. Claire drove Daniel back toward town, briefly so he could meet investigators at the sheriff's office, while Axel remained under veterinary supervision overnight. The drive through the mountains felt strangely different now. The storm had passed. Sunlight reflected brilliantly across fresh snow, while smoke curled from chimneys deep in the valleys below. But Black Hollow itself no longer felt sleepy. Satellite vans lined the courthouse square. News reporters stood outside the diner speaking into cameras, while deputies moved in and out of the sheriff's office carrying boxes of documents. The town looked stunned, like a man waking slowly from anesthesia. Daniel stepped from Claire's truck carefully. People noticed him immediately. Whispers followed. The homeless veteran who reopened Samuel Ritter's forge. The outsider who found the truth. Daniel hated the attention instantly. Crowds tightened something painful inside his chest. Too many eyes, too much noise. The sheriff met him outside personally. Sheriff Miles Corbett looked tired and deeply uncomfortable beneath his heavy winter coat. "Mr. Mercer," he said quietly, "federal investigators would like a statement." Daniel nodded once. Inside the sheriff's office, warm air smelled of coffee, wet boots, and old paperwork. 2 federal investigators sat waiting beside stacks of Samuel Ritter's journals and records already spread across a conference table. One of them looked up sharply as Daniel entered. "You're the one who found the chamber?" Daniel remained standing. "Yes." The older investigator gestured toward the records. "These documents identify nearly 24 soldiers listed incorrectly as missing after the Korean War." He paused carefully. Some families were denied compensation entirely. Daniel stared silently at the papers. 24 names, 24 families waiting decades for answers. The younger investigator slid a photograph across the table. Thomas Voss, Gordon's father, Army supply officer. The younger man spoke quietly. Your blacksmith Samuel Ritter may have uncovered one of the largest regional military theft operations we've seen from that period. Daniel looked down at the photograph. Why wasn't it investigated? The room fell briefly silent. Finally, the older investigator answered. Because the men involved were connected. He sighed heavily. Judges, business owners, local officials. People protected each other. Claire leaned against the doorway nearby, listening silently. Daniel suddenly understood something terrible. Samuel Ritter had never really expected justice. He only hoped the truth would survive long enough for someone decent to find it someday. The older investigator looked directly at Daniel. You realize you're probably the reason this case finally opens again. Daniel thought about that. Then about Axel bleeding on the forge floor while trying to protect evidence hidden by dead men. No, Daniel said quietly. The reason is Samuel Ritter. Silence settled over the room, because everyone there understood the truth. A broken blacksmith had guarded those secrets alone for half a century because nobody else would. By evening, Gordon Voss had disappeared, his trucks abandoned, his scrapyard locked. Rumors spread through town faster than snowfall. Some said he fled. Others claimed federal agents already found hidden financial records tied to his family. Black Hollow buzzed with nervous energy. But Daniel felt strangely detached from all of it, because none of it mattered, compared to the veterinary clinic waiting 40 miles away. Claire drove him back through the mountains near sunset. The sky burned orange behind the ridges, while snow-covered forests glowed softly beneath fading light. You did a good thing, Claire said quietly from behind the wheel. Daniel stared out the window. It got my dog stabbed. Claire tightened her grip slightly. He still saved you. Daniel looked down at his scarred hands. No, he said softly. He keeps saving me. They reached the clinic just after dark. Axel slept quietly beneath blankets when Daniel entered recovery. For the first time since the attack, the old Malinois looked peaceful. No guarding, no tension, just rest. Daniel sat beside him while soft snow drifted outside the windows. Then he noticed something hanging beside the recovery cage. Axel's old military K9 collar. The worn leather still carried faded unit markings from deployments overseas. Daniel stared at it a long time, then finally understood what Samuel Ritter had protected beneath that forge all those years. Not evidence, not gold, memory. The proof that forgotten men once existed, and proof mattered, because once memory disappeared, so did the people who carried it. Spring arrived slowly in Black Hollow. The snow retreated first from the roads, then from the rooftops, and finally from the dark forest edges climbing the Appalachian ridges behind Samuel Ritter's forge. Water rushed through swollen creeks beneath thawing ice, while fog drifted gently through the valleys each morning like the mountains, exhaling after a long winter. Daniel Mercer stood outside the blacksmith shop one cold sunrise, watching steam rise from his coffee cup. For the first time in months, the world felt quiet. Not empty quiet. There was a difference. Behind him, the forge glowed warmly through the open doorway, while the steady sound of Axel's breathing drifted softly from inside. The old Malinois slept near the fire now more often than not. Recovery had been slow. The knife wound healed, but age showed itself afterward in ways Daniel could no longer ignore. Axel walked stiffly some mornings. His left rear leg shook occasionally after long periods standing guard. The veterinarian had warned Daniel gently that trauma accelerated decline in older working dogs. Daniel heard the warning, but refused to accept it fully. Not yet. Inside the forge, Axel lifted his head as Daniel entered, carrying another armload of split firewood. "You're supposed to be resting," Daniel muttered. Axel thumped his tail once against the floor. The forge no longer resembled the abandoned ruin Daniel first discovered beneath winter fog months earlier. It had become alive again. New shingles covered the roof. Fresh-cut oak reinforced the porch supports. The cracked forge chimney had been repaired stone by stone by volunteers from town. Samuel Ritter's tools hung, cleaned and polished along the workshop walls. While new shelves held ironwork, Daniel had begun forging during the long winter recovery. Hooks, fireplace tools, garden gates, memorial plaques for veterans' families. Word spread far beyond Black Hollow now. People drove hours through the mountains just to watch the old forge burn again. At first, Daniel hated the attention. Crowd still unsettled him. Too many conversations at once tightened his chest and made his pulse climb unpredictably. Sudden loud noises still dragged pieces of war back into the room without warning. But something unexpected had happened over the last few months. The forge gave people purpose, and purpose brought patience. Nobody pushed him. Nobody demanded explanations. They simply showed up. A farmer arrived one morning with lumber stacked in his truck bed. Another veteran donated welding equipment. A retired machinist from Charleston rebuilt Samuel Ritter's old drill press free of charge after reading about the forge in the newspaper. Even local kids began stopping by after school to watch Daniel work steel beneath the hammer. At first, he barely spoke to them. Then gradually, he started teaching. Hold the tongs farther back. Don't fight the hammer. Let the weight work. Steel remembers how you treat it. Simple lessons. But the children listened carefully, especially when Axel supervised nearby. The old Malinois had become something of a legend around Black Hollow. Parents brought children just to meet the retired military dog who protected the forge during the break-in. Axel tolerated the attention with quiet dignity. Though Daniel noticed something important, the dog no longer positioned himself constantly near the doors. For months, Axel had guarded every entrance instinctively, watching windows, monitoring shadows, waiting for danger. But now, he slept deeply beside the forge, really slept, sometimes for hours. The realization hit Daniel unexpectedly one afternoon, while shaping a horseshoe at the anvil. Axel finally believed they were safe. That thought nearly broke him. Claire Bennett visited often now, sometimes bringing supplies, sometimes simply sitting quietly in the forge office grading school papers while Daniel worked nearby. Neither of them talked much about it, but the silence between them had become comfortable, familiar. One rainy evening, she watched Daniel teaching two teenage boys how to shape heated steel into coat hooks. "You're good at this," she said after the boys left. Daniel snorted softly. "Terrible business model. I'm serious." He returned the glowing steel to the forge. Claire leaned against the workbench, studying him carefully. "You know, half the veterans around here started showing up because of you?" Daniel frowned slightly. "I didn't ask them to." "No," Claire said gently. "That's why they trust you." The words settled heavily in the room. Daniel stared into the fire. Veterans had indeed begun arriving quietly at the forge during the past several weeks. Not large groups, one at a time usually, men carrying invisible weight behind their eyes. A former Marine missing 2 fingers from Fallujah, an army medic who hadn't slept properly in years, a National Guardsman recently divorced after too many deployments. They came because they heard about the forge, because they heard another broken veteran somehow rebuilt himself there. Most never asked questions. They simply stood near the warmth while Daniel worked, watching sparks rise, listening to hammer strikes echo across the valley, and slowly talking, not about politics, not about medals, about nightmares, isolation, anger, the strange guilt veterans carried after surviving things better people didn't. Daniel rarely gave advice. He simply listened. Sometimes that mattered more. One evening, a younger veteran named Travis stayed long after sunset, helping Daniel repair wagon hardware near the forge. Travis stared into the fire quietly before speaking. "Feels strange here." Daniel glanced toward him. How peaceful. Travis hesitated. Like the noise in my head slows down. Daniel looked around the shop, the glowing forge, the hanging tools, Axel asleep nearby beneath warm firelight. He understood exactly what the younger man meant. Samuel Ritter understood it too. Work steadied damaged minds, not perfectly, but enough. Weeks later, federal investigators finally completed excavation beneath the forge chamber. The findings made national news. 27 missing soldiers officially identified. Compensation theft records tied directly to Thomas Voss and several county officials from the 1950s. Families received long-delayed answers after generations of silence. Several military families even traveled to Black Hollow, personally, to thank Daniel. He hated every interview, every camera, every spotlight. But one elderly woman changed him. Her brother's dog tags had been hidden beneath Samuel Ritter's forge all those years. She held the tags in trembling hands outside the blacksmith shop one afternoon, while tears ran quietly down her face. "I thought the army forgot him," she whispered. Daniel looked toward Samuel Ritter's old hammer hanging above the anvil. "No," he said softly. "Somebody remembered." After she left, Daniel stood alone beside the forge for a long time. Then finally understood something important. Samuel Ritter had not hidden those records because he believed justice would come quickly. He hid them because memory itself mattered. Even delayed truth still carried dignity. Outside, spring deepened across the mountains. Wildflowers appeared along creek banks. The town of Black Hollow slowly changed too. People smiled more now when passing the forge. The old building no longer represented fear or buried secrets. It represented survival. One Saturday evening, the town hosted its first spring festival in years beside the courthouse square. Children ran through the streets carrying paper lanterns, while local musicians played bluegrass beneath strings of hanging lights. Daniel almost didn't attend. Crowds still tightened something nervous inside him, but Claire convinced him, "You don't have to stay long." So Daniel came. Axel walked slowly beside him, wearing his retired canine collar. People noticed immediately. Applause spread quietly through the crowd as Daniel crossed the square. Not loud, not overwhelming, respectful. Veterans nodded toward him, children waved at Axel. For once, Daniel did not feel trapped by attention. He simply felt seen. Later that night, he returned to the forge, exhausted but strangely lighter inside. Axel limped toward his usual spot beside the fire before lowering himself carefully onto the floorboards with a deep, contented sigh. Daniel sat nearby, watching sparks drift upward through the chimney. Then he noticed something that stopped him completely. Axel had fallen asleep facing away from the door, not guarding, resting, trusting. Daniel stared at the old dog quietly, then looked around the forge itself. Samuel Ritter's tools, the repaired walls, the glowing fire, voices from town still faintly echoing down the valley outside. This place had become more than shelter, more than a workshop. It had become proof that broken things could still serve a purpose. Daniel lowered one hand gently onto Axel's neck. The old Malinois barely stirred. For the first time in years, both soldier and dog finally felt home beginning to settle around them. And neither of them wanted to run anymore. Summer came green and deep to the Appalachian Mountains. The forests surrounding Black Hollow thickened beneath warm sunlight, while the creeks ran clear through valleys bursting with wildflowers and tall grass. Every evening, smoke curled steadily from the chimney of Samuel Ritter's forge, drifting upward through the trees exactly the way it had half a century earlier. Only now the sound of hammer strikes returned with it. Life had returned too. Daniel Mercer stood beside the glowing forge, one warm July evening, shaping heated steel beneath Samuel Ritter's old hammer, while three teenagers watched carefully nearby, wearing leather aprons and heavy gloves. "Don't rush the metal," Daniel said over the ringing anvil. "You force it too hard, it cracks." The youngest boy nodded nervously. Daniel handed him the hammer. "Your turn." The teenager hesitated, then struck carefully. The steel bent slightly beneath the blow. Beside the forge, Axel lifted his head briefly from his usual place near the fire, before settling back down again with a soft grunt of approval. The old Malinois had grown slower during the summer. His muzzle had whitened almost completely now. Long days tired him more easily. Sometimes, his injured shoulder stiffened badly enough that Daniel carried him up the loft stairs at night, rather than forcing him to climb. But Axel still insisted on being near the forge every evening while it burned. Always near Daniel, always watching the fire. The forge itself had become something no one in Black Hollow could have imagined months earlier. Children visited after school to learn basic ironwork. Veterans gathered on weekends beneath the open workshop doors, sharing coffee and quiet conversations, while sparks drifted upward into the mountain air. Families drove from neighboring counties during festivals just to see the old blacksmith shop alive again. Nobody called it Condemned anymore. Now people simply called it Mercer's Forge. Daniel hated the name, but secretly, he understood why it mattered. One afternoon, a delivery truck arrived carrying a wooden crate addressed from the Department of Defense. Inside rested 27 newly engraved memorial plaques honoring the soldiers whose records Samuel Ritter had hidden beneath the forge. Each plaque carried a name, a unit, a story finally returned to history. Daniel mounted them carefully along one wall inside the workshop, beside Samuel Ritter's journals sealed safely behind glass. People stood quietly in front of those names now whenever they visited. Some cried, some saluted. Some simply stared silently at the dog tags displayed beneath the photographs. Memory had finally become visible again, and visible things were harder to bury. Late one evening after closing the forge, Daniel sat alone outside on the porch steps, watching fireflies drift through the dark valley below. Axel lay beside him with his head resting across Daniel's boot. The mountains stretched endless beneath the stars, peaceful. Claire Bennett stepped quietly onto the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You missed dinner again," she said. Daniel accepted the coffee. "Lost track of time." "You always lose track of time," he smiled faintly. That still felt strange sometimes, smiling, not forced, not polite, real. Claire sat beside him, watching the valley lights below. "You know the town council wants to officially protect the forge as a historical landmark." Daniel groaned softly. "Sounds expensive." Claire laughed quietly. "It means they're proud of it." Daniel stared out toward the mountains. For 50 years, people were scared of this place. Not anymore. Silence settled comfortably between them. Then Claire spoke again. "You ever think about leaving?" The question surprised him. Daniel looked down at Axel sleeping peacefully beside the porch rail. Then toward the forge glowing warmly behind them. The answer came easier than he expected. No, and he meant it. Because the forge had changed something inside him that years of therapy never reached. Purpose, not survival. Purpose, there was a difference. Weeks later, during Black Hollow's Summer Heritage Festival, the forge stayed crowded nearly all day. Children lined up for blacksmith demonstrations while bluegrass music drifted through town beneath strings of hanging lights. Farmers sold peaches and honey from roadside stands. Veterans gathered beneath shaded tents, swapping stories no civilians could fully understand. Daniel moved through the crowd more comfortably now, still cautious, still watchful, but no longer disconnected from everyone around him. Healing did not happen all at once. It happened quietly, in pieces. That afternoon, Sheriff Corbett arrived carrying a small wooden case beneath one arm. "I figured this belongs with you," he said. Daniel opened the case slowly. Inside rested Samuel Ritter's folded American flag recovered from storage after federal investigators completed the case. Beneath it sat Walter Kane's restored military dog tags. Daniel stared silently at them. Sheriff Corbett lowered his voice. "Families wanted them displayed here." Daniel looked toward Axel, lying near the forge doorway, greeting children patiently. Two forgotten veterans, one blacksmith, one dog handler, and now their memory finally had a home again. That evening, after the festival ended and the crowds faded back into the mountains, Daniel remained alone inside the forge cleaning tools while warm firelight danced across the walls. Axel slept deeply near the anvil. Outside, crickets filled the valley with soft summer noise. Daniel moved slowly around the workshop, extinguishing lanterns one by one until only the forge remained glowing softly in the darkness. Then footsteps sounded outside. Not threatening, uncertain. Daniel looked toward the doorway. A young man stood there carrying an old duffel bag over one shoulder, maybe late 20s, thin, exhausted. The kind of exhaustion Daniel recognized immediately because he once carried it himself. The young man glanced awkwardly toward the forge. "You Daniel Mercer?" Daniel nodded once. The stranger swallowed nervously. "I heard veterans come here sometimes." Daniel studied him quietly, shaking hands, haunted eyes, the subtle way he positioned himself near exits automatically. "Combat veteran, no question." "What's your name?" Daniel asked. "Eli." "You hungry, Eli?" The young man hesitated before nodding slightly. Daniel motioned him inside. "There's stew on the stove." Eli stepped cautiously into the forge while Axel lifted his head slowly from beside the fire. The old Malinois watched the stranger several seconds. Then, satisfied, lowered his head back down again. Trust granted. Daniel handed Eli a bowl of stew before noticing the younger man staring at the walls. The memorial plaques, the hanging tools, the glowing forge itself. "You work here?" Eli asked quietly. Daniel looked toward the fire. "Yeah." The younger veteran nodded slowly. Then, after a long silence, "You need help?" Daniel stared into the flames. Months earlier, that question would have frightened him. Responsibility, connection, people depending on him again. But now the answer felt simple, necessary even. "Yeah," Daniel said softly. "Fires like this aren't meant to burn alone." The forge crackled gently beside them. Outside, warm Appalachian wind moved through the trees beneath a sky crowded with stars. Daniel crossed slowly toward the wall above the anvil, where three objects now hung together permanently beneath the forge lights. Samuel Ritter's hammer, Daniel's Navy SEAL trident, Axel's retired K9 combat collar, past service loyalty, all surviving together beneath one roof. Daniel rested one hand against Axel's neck. The old Malinois opened his eyes briefly before relaxing again beside the warmth of the forge. Peaceful, safe, finally home. And as hammer strikes once again echoed softly through the mountains of Black Hollow, long into the summer night, Daniel Mercer understood the truth Samuel Ritter had discovered long before him. He had never rescued the forge had rescued him. Final image. The old blacksmith shop glowing warmly beneath the Appalachian night, while Axel slept peacefully beside the fire, and the sound of steel against steel rolled outward through the mountains like a heartbeat refusing to die. If you believe good men and loyal dogs still deserve a place in this world, drop a strong yes down in the comments. And tell us where you're watching from tonight. We love seeing these stories travel across America. Sometimes the things people throw away end up saving a life. Subscribe if you'd like to stay with us for more stories about justice, grit, second chances, and the people who refuse to quit.